Assalamualaikum, salam Malaysia Madani. I'm Otto Othman. Welcome to Biz Malaysia. Now, every Thursday, we feature Biz Asean, discussing various issues related to the regional economy in conjunction with Malaysia's ASEAN chairmanship this year. Now, it's been a pivotal year by Malaysia, of course, but not just as a key player in ASEAN, but also as the architect of our nation's 13th Malaysia Plan, RMK13. Now, as chair of ASEAN 2025, Malaysia has helped steer the region through shifting trade dynamics, a green economy push, and rising digitalization. Now, at the same time, RMK13 has laid down strategic reforms from public sector transformation and energy transition to strengthening the role of MSMEs and building an inclusive high-income economy. Now, to discuss the ongoing ASEAN momentum and the reforms introduced under RMK13, we'll be joined shortly by our guest from the University of Nottingham, Malaysia. But before that, we move further on today's topic. Here are some news updates. Now, Budget 2026 to be tabled this October will be aligned with the implementation of the first year of the 13th Malaysia Plan. Now, Prime Minister Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim said this is to ensure the country's development trajectory is consistent with the medium-term policy framework introduced earlier. Now, according to the Prime Minister, the upcoming budget would focus on two key aspects, namely raising the spending ceiling to drive growth and strategic investments, and increasing the priority floor to safeguard the well-being of the Rakyat, especially low-income groups. Now, speaking at the Budget 2026 engagement session today, the Prime Minister said rising the ceiling strategy would continue to spur investment and economic growth. Now, while the floor approach would guarantee improved access to basic services like education, healthcare, and minimum income in line with the government's reform agenda. Now, moving on to Market Watch, most ASEAN stock markets opened mixed today and amid improved investor sentiment across the region. Now, for their ASEAN stock market analysis, let's follow the report from Muhammad Shakil Haziq Muhammad Zubil, remiser from the Malaysian Bumiputra Remiser Association Pribumi.
The most Asian market open mixed today was better sentiment. The RMK13 Malaysian market we see open slightly lower at 1540, down 1.48 points or 0.09%. The JCI Indonesia opened higher at 7563, up 60 points or 0.81%. The STI Singapore opened higher at 4255, up 28 points or 0.67%. The Philippines opened slightly lower at 6335, down 35 points or 0.55%, and also the Vietnam opened slightly lower at 1572, down 1 point or 0.04%. And as we can see, Wall Street ended higher overnight with the S&P 500 and Nasdaq supported by strong corporate earning. Tech giant like Apple surged 2.8% on news of a US 100 billion local manufacturing pledge, while Arista Network and Match Group jumped over 10% on better than expected results. At the same time, market are increasingly pricing in a Fed rate cut as early as September, with odds now at 89%, driven by weak US job data and stalled service sector. But investors remain cautious. You see, President Trump's tariff threats on pharma and chips and are fueling fresh uncertainty with new levies expected in the coming days. The mixed backdrop, solid earnings but macro jitter may boost short-term risk appetite in Asian market, especially in the tech export-heavy sector like Malaysia and Vietnam. However, trade-related tensions and Fed policy will remain key watch point in the coming weeks.
Up next, an in-depth look at our ASEAN Brief segment. as ASEAN chairman for 2025, Malaysia has helped drive regional progress in the face of shifting trade dynamics, accelerating digitalization, and the global push for a green economy. Now, from deeper economic integration to advancing sustainable goals, ASEAN is making real progress, and Malaysia is right at the center of that momentum. Back home, the RMK13 is shifting or setting the lure or tone for Malaysia's transformation by outlining key strategic reforms across economy, society, and also the environment. So the big question is, with ASEAN momentum building and RMK13 reforms now underway, what's next for Malaysia? Today, we have, of course, going to unpack what's at stake and what has been achieved so far and what Malaysia must do next with this as well. So today we have Dr. Tricia Yeo, Associate Professor for Practice School of Politics and International Relations from University of Nottingham, Malaysia, to share her thoughts on today's matter. Thank you so much, Doctor, for coming to the studio.
Thanks for inviting and thanks for having me.
Now, Malaysia, as the chair of ASEAN, right? What have you achieved so far? It's been 7 months since Malaysia took the lead as ASEAN chair. Now, what have you seen so far?
So first off, I think we just want to say that it's a particularly eventful year, not just for ASEAN, but for the world because of the announcements that took place on Liberation Day from the US regarding the reciprocal tariffs. So I think, having that at the start of the year already puts a lot of countries, ASEAN as a regional bloc included, on a sort of situation where they had to respond very quickly. So ASEAN has always talked about economic integration. So this year has been a test for this regional bloc to see whether the bloc would be able to negotiate as a bloc as opposed to individual countries. So I think at the outset, that is something that ASEAN has certainly attempted to do. At the end, of course, the individual countries did have individual negotiations with the US, but I do think this has accelerated ASEAN's thinking as to why it's so important to integrate as a common economy. So that's one. In terms of the other achievements, I mean, of course, every year you have a very packed, full ASEAN calendar, and that's been no different for Malaysia chairing. Of course, we have the foreign ministers meeting, we have the summit, we have another summit coming up. What's different this year is that we had the ASEAN GCC China summit, where a lot of new talk and new agreements were discussed. I think the two big things that we may want to say is that there's an upgrade of the ASEAN-China Free Trade Agreement and also the upgrade of the ASEAN Trade in Goods Agreement. And the one thing we want to look forward to is the DEFA, the Digital Economic Framework, the agreement which is going to hopefully come about at the end of the year. The last thing, I know, I just talking about kind of top line, big ticket items. The last thing that has just happened, of course, is Malaysia's successful bringing together of the two nations in terms of approving the ceasefire or having achieved and accomplished a ceasefire between Thailand and Cambodia. So I think that precisely encapsulates the role that a regional bloc like ASEAN is there to do. It precisely tells you that when there are these moments of potential crisis, of potential tension geopolitically, that's where ASEAN can step in.
Well, that's great as well, especially when it comes to the ASEAN Digital Economy Framework, which has been tabled as well. And also, it seems that the launch of the ASEAN Community Vision post-2025 as well. But before that, we've moved further towards the further questions with you, Doctor. We're going to go for a little short break, and when we come back, we'll follow back with our doctor today and follow up on today's little question. We're going to go for a short break for make way for the ASEAN prayers.
Untuk lebih jimat. Terlepas dari siaran program-program menarik di RTM, jom saksikan semuanya di RTM Klik.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. Hayya 'ala as-salah. حي على الصلاة. حي على الفلاح. حي على الفلاح. الله أكبر، الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله.
اللهم رب هذه الدعوة التامة والصلاة القائمة آت سيدنا محمدا الوسيلة والفضيلة والشرف والدرجة العالية الرفيعة وابعثه مقاما محمودا الذي وعدته إنك لا تخلف الميعاد.
Mencari pakej terbaik untuk mempromosikan jenama anda? Kami ada 5 pilihan pakej menarik yang mampu memenuhi keperluan anda. Hanya untuk tempoh terhad. Jadi tunggu apa lagi? Hubungi kami sekarang untuk keterangan lanjut.
ASEAN Glossary. ASEAN Glossary. Welcome back. You're watching Biz Malaysia, and just one day away, ASEAN will celebrate its 58th year of unity and progress. As chair of ASEAN for 2025, Malaysia stands ready to continue to lead with purpose, championing inclusivity, sustainability, and also regional solidarity. Now, before the break, on ASEAN Brief segment, we are discussing on ASEAN wins, RMK13 moves, and what's next. Now, with our guest in the studios today, we have Dr. Tricia Yeo, Associate Professor of Practice School of Politics and International Relations from University of Nottingham, Malaysia. Once again, thank you so much for coming to the studio. Now, moving on to today's little question. Now, we keep hearing that Malaysia has been able to actually bring ASEAN countries closer together, especially with all trade tensions lately. So how do you foresee that?
So, as I mentioned in the earlier segment, ASEAN has always been this entity that people call out, right? It's unclear what its main objectives are. It's not like the EU. It doesn't have a common currency. It doesn't have the kind of security protocols and arrangements that the EU does. But like I said, I think it's really this year that you start to see the value and the benefit of having a regional entity, like a platform. So people might say that, okay, what has it actually done? But I think the alternative might be challenging as well, right? Like without such an entity, without such a regional platform, it would be very difficult for the nations, especially smaller nations within the region, smaller in terms of both geographic size, in terms of you know the impact and influence that it has politically. And it's simply in terms of trade as well. So the theory has always been that if you pull these countries together, you have like a great economic powerhouse. So in terms of bringing the countries together, I think this is where I think the smaller nations would actually definitely feel that they value this partnership more. The bigger nations would need to be able to provide that leadership, right? Mm-hmm. So for the smaller nations to actually feel that there is regional leadership that was taking shape. So an example, again, if you're talking about the ceasefire, you know, with Thailand and Cambodia, I think it would be difficult to imagine if there was no ASEAN in place. You know, could Malaysia, so yes, Malaysia as a slightly bigger economy in this respect, would Malaysia have been able to successfully negotiate and broker that deal, like if not for ASEAN in place?
Exactly. And since we're welcoming also Timor-Leste into the picture, wouldn't you think that it will be quite intricate as well? It's been more than 50 years that we have established ASEAN, and it seems that we're the 5th largest economy in the world with combined gross domestic product of $3.7 trillion US dollars. Now, would you think it will be much more difficult in terms of making agreements and all that?
No, in fact, I think ASEAN as a whole has been negotiating agreements with other parties, with China, you know, it's with the US, and I think the US would probably see this entity, as you mentioned, the 5th largest global trading nation in the world, would see it as a larger economic powerhouse as opposed to dealing with singular individual countries on a one-by-one basis.
It's interesting that you mentioned about the US. Seeing that Donald Trump might be showing up, how do you think that that's going to actually change the mood or direction of the summit?
I think many of the countries and the leadership are still very circumspect. As we all know, we've just seen the announcements of the newly negotiated tariffs. In fact, these new reciprocal tariffs that have been announced for Malaysia, of course, we know it's gone down from 24% to 19%. That's going to be rolled out today. So not just on that front, but on the other front as well, right? Like the kind of perception that not just Malaysia, but many Southeast Asian countries have towards the US with regards to their foreign policy, especially what has happened in Gaza and in the Middle East. So welcoming Donald Trump to Malaysia, on the one hand, is necessary because you can't shut off, by the way, the largest export market for Malaysia. You can't shut off a very huge investor into Malaysia. But at the same time, it comes with a lot of cultural misgivings. We saw as well the ambassador that the US has chosen to come to Malaysia. I think the sentiment locally would be very mixed, and I would say circumspect. And what happens when Trump actually arrives in Malaysia, I expect that there will be a lot of consternation among the locals.
Now, how is Malaysia planning to actually balance strong ties with the US under Trump, and while still staying close to China as well? How do you think that's going to go?
So if you look at, again, the renegotiated tariffs that have just been announced, I think 19% Malaysia was successful. So again, you know, congratulations to our MITI and the Minister Tunku Zafrul for having worked very hard to negotiate this down. And on balance of things, I think we managed to emerge I think if you compare with the regional neighbors as well, not as great as Singapore, but I think we would never have reached the 10% rating, but relatively unscathed. But I think, so I would caveat that to say that in terms of the agreements that Malaysia has done, in terms of what we've agreed to purchase, so we are buying, what, $150 billion worth of semiconductors, aerospace, including many of these Boeing aircrafts, as well as data centers, right? And then, of course, on top of that, you also have purchase of LNG via Petronas, and some of the other concessions, nothing to do with the more major red lines. When you talk about Bumiputra, halal, procurement issues, are those things we managed to secure. But these things and these concessions are quite huge as well. So, being able to bring down the tariffs to, 98% of US exports into Malaysia. So many of these things, I think, are actually larger in terms of the quantifiable things that we've put on the table compared to some of our neighbors.
Now, do you think this next meeting could actually add or probably be much more of a deferment towards the 19%? Should there be a concern for Malaysia to actually US come to Malaysia? Should we think that 19% could be just part of it? Or could it change in the near future?
I mean, the problem is that whatever decision is made, there will be criticism invited. So, for example, if you talk about the concessions that were given to the US, there will be criticism of that, and we've seen some of that. But on the other hand, if you talk about the tariff reduction to 19%, it is, relatively a large amount of 5% down. But even then, 19% is also high. So what's going to happen to our own industries, and not to mention the fact that US is also imposing 100% tariff on semiconductors. So that's still uncertain. And on top of that, you have a 40% transshipment tariff. So any goods that have conceivably something to do with China, meaning that some goods or some parts have come from China, stands to be taxed on top of the existing 19%. But I think it's still unclear as to what percentage of goods from China would be considered a 40% tariff slapped on top. And so this is a problem because, if following from the first US-China trade war, a lot of companies actually sought the China +1 model, and this is where the supply chain of Southeast Asia has been so deeply integrated over the last 5 to 8 years, and it's very difficult to roll these back. But whatever the case, I do think that so fine. So we're done with the negotiation. This is rolling out today, and tomorrow the rollout of the transshipment tariff is taking place. So what now, right? So now Malaysia still needs to be very cautious as to the impact on our own economy. Because yes, our semiconductor industry, just before Trump came into power, we've been announcing so many investments into semiconductors, so many investments into data centers, into Johor, remember all that, right? And we welcome all that. But will there be implication on this?
Which comes to the next question, RMK. Let's talk about RMK13. Now, let's talk about the planned setting of Malaysia up to become one of Asia's leading economies. So let's talk about that. How do we actually, become that?
So, 5-year Malaysia plans, we know that they actually merely reflect what the government's existing policy already is. So I'm a little bit mixed as to whether there is value in producing these 5-year plans. On the one hand, it's a good signal to investors, it's a good signal to analysts and to researchers like us to say, okay, this is what the government intends to do, and in a way you kind of hold government to account based on that. But on the other hand, 5-year plans can also be considered highly outdated because things move really quickly. You're talking about AI that's coming into place, green economy, the environmental impact of what's happening with regards to the climate crisis. Things happen quickly. So you need 5-year plans, but at the same time, you need to have that kind of flexibility and adaptability built into the institutions and the systems so that we can respond on a more agile basis.
Looks like we have our job ahead of us. Now, what industries are we really focusing on to stay ahead? Is it tech, clean energy, or something else, do you think?
So the government has emphasized, I mean, in the Malaysia plan, I'm glad to see things like good governance and institutional reform there. I think this is something that this particular government, cannot run away from. You need institutional strength to be able to deliver anything. The emphasis that government has done, I mean, they've put out so many different strategies, among which would be the semiconductor strategy. You've got AI coming into place, and there's a huge ASEAN AI conference as well. I look forward to seeing what the governance around AI is going to look like, especially in Southeast Asia. We are not the leaders on that front, right? And then the third linked area would be to do with green economy and tech. This seems to be what the government has put emphasis on, but at the same time, it's really important to see how they square against each other, because sometimes there may be some conflicting policy that each of them has with each other as well. So you can't sometimes want to push AI and tech at the same time as wanting a green economy, because they may be counterproductive to each other. What is the impact on the energy source, the energy requirements of Malaysia? I mean, this is why some countries actually don't want data centers, because it actually sucks up so much energy, and the same goes for AI. So we need to be able to see how these two potentially conflicting policy priorities square with each other.
Hence with the power grid that's happening right now.
Exactly.
Now, before we end, what is the big picture that you think with everything Malaysia is doing this year, and are we really on track to becoming an economic hub of ASEAN?
So economic hub of ASEAN, I do think Malaysia is going in the right direction. I mean, one of the priorities is economic complexity, and economic complexity has been emphasized by the government. But and the theory, of course, is that if you make the economy more complex, then you're going to increase wages, you're going to uplift the economy more generally. I think my bigger concern here is the fiscal sustainability story, which government has to stay on track, right? Stay on track when it talks about subsidy rationalization, when it talks about reducing subsidies on petrol, for example, like stay the course, don't be too distracted, or I mean, I understand that there are political concerns here, but the final thing is that the concessions that we've made to the US, how is that going to impact upon, for example, our fiscal deficit, our debt to GDP, limitations, which by the way have been spelled out in a Public Finance and Fiscal Responsibility Act. So the fiscal squeeze, while at the same time having to deal with the global impact of this trade war, I think that's the priority that any government coming into power will have to deal with.
Looks like that we have a lot on our table as well. So hopefully that everything goes well. But the take of it is that we're going the right trajectory, and hopefully that we can follow through to that. All right. So with that, of course, thank you very much to our guests here. That's all the time that we have for Biz ASEAN. And thank you very much for joining us. Thanks to our guests, Dr. Tricia Yeo from University of Nottingham, Malaysia, for coming to the studio. And once again, Biz Malaysia airs every Monday through Thursday via Berita RTM and TV1, in addition to Facebook Live and also YouTube Malaysia. Now, I'm Ogos, Malaysia Madani, Rakyat, Disantuni. Thanks for watching.